For weeks now, one question has continued to follow the Nolan Wells case. What really happened during those final moments? Was the distress call simply a desperate plea for help? Or could there be something in that recording that people have been hearing differently ever since enhanced versions began appearing online? Now another piece of the story has come back into focus: the autopsy. And when people began comparing what is publicly known about the autopsy with the growing debate surrounding the enhanced audio, an important problem became impossible to ignore. People were starting to treat two very different pieces of evidence as though they were telling the same story. They aren't. The audio concerns what listeners believe they can hear. The autopsy concerns medical findings. And neither one, based on the publicly available information, has provided the simple answer so many people are hoping for. That is where this story gets complicated, because the internet has been filled with claims about hidden sounds, enhanced recordings, and details that supposedly change the entire picture. But what happens when we slow down and separate what has actually been established from what people believe they are hearing? Before we go any further, I want to hear from those of you who have been following the Nolan Wells case. When you first heard the distress call, did you believe you were hearing something important that investigators might have missed, or were you more cautious about drawing conclusions from the recording? Let me know in the comments. I'm genuinely interested in hearing how you interpreted it when you first heard it. And if you appreciate the way we approach these cases, taking our time, looking at the available evidence, and separating what we know from what we don't know, consider subscribing. Because there is still a lot more to this story. Now, let's go back to the beginning of this particular controversy. According to publicly available information, recordings connected to Nolan Wells' final known moments have circulated widely online, and over time, different creators began uploading their own versions of the audio. Some attempted to reduce background noise. Others increased the volume. Some tried to isolate particular frequencies. And eventually, artificial intelligence became part of the conversation. The promise was simple: make the recording clearer, bring the voice forward, remove the noise. Perhaps reveal something that ordinary listeners could not hear. And that sounds reasonable. Most of us have experienced something similar. Think about an old cassette tape from years ago. You play it after decades, and the recording is faint. There is hiss in the background. Someone is speaking, but you can barely make out the words. Then someone cleans up the recording. Suddenly, you can hear more. But there is an important limit. Enhancement can sometimes make information easier to hear. It cannot reliably recover information that was never captured in the first place. And that distinction became increasingly important in the Nolan Wells discussion. One person would listen to an enhanced version and insist they heard a particular word. Another person would listen to the same recording and hear something completely different. Someone else would hear nothing unusual at all. That should make us pause, because once someone tells you what you are supposed to hear, your brain can begin searching for that sound. It's something many of us have experienced without even realizing it. Think about those old television mysteries, where detectives would replay a grainy surveillance tape over and over again. The camera would show a dark figure in the distance. Someone would say, "Look at the person near the door," and suddenly, everyone watching would be staring at that exact spot. Sometimes the detail was real, sometimes it wasn't. The same basic problem can happen with unclear audio. If you're told that a recording contains a certain word, you may begin hearing that word, even when the original recording doesn't clearly establish it. That is why forensic audio work generally requires a comparison between the original recording and any processed version. And according to the material available here, investigators have not publicly confirmed that the enhanced versions circulating online represent official investigative evidence. That distinction matters a great deal, because an audio file being shared thousands of times does not automatically make it verified evidence. A creator saying they have cleaned up a recording does not mean investigators have reached the same conclusion. And a dramatic interpretation of a sound does not necessarily establish what actually happened. Then there is the autopsy. Whenever people hear the word autopsy, there is a natural expectation that it will provide certainty. It can provide important information. It can document injuries. It can identify medical conditions. It can contribute to establishing a timeline. But an autopsy is not usually a complete explanation of every event surrounding someone's final moments. Investigators compare medical findings with other evidence. Witness statements. phone records, digital information, search efforts, physical evidence, vehicle movements, and timelines. The goal is to determine whether all of these pieces fit together. That brings us to the point where the online conversation around Nolan Wells became especially difficult to follow. The enhanced audio was being discussed as though it could answer questions that actually belonged to the broader investigation. At the same time, the autopsy was being discussed as though it could independently confirm or disprove interpretations of the recording. But publicly available information has not established that one confirms the other. They are separate pieces of a much larger puzzle. And that is something worth remembering before we go any further, because there is another detail that stands out. As more enhanced versions appeared online, the question began to change. People were no longer asking only, "What do you hear?" They were asking something more fundamental. Can we trust what we're hearing? That is a very different question. And it brings us to the technology behind these recordings. Modern audio software can do remarkable things. It can reduce certain background sounds. It can increase volume. It can emphasize particular frequencies. And some artificial intelligence systems can attempt to reconstruct unclear speech. But reconstruction is not the same thing as recovering preserved evidence. If a recording never captured a particular word clearly, software may produce an output that sounds convincing without proving that the word was actually spoken. Imagine restoring an old family photograph. You can brighten it. You can remove scratches. You can sharpen the image. You can improve the contrast. But if the original photograph never captured someone's eye color, no honest restoration can prove what that eye color was. Audio presents a similar problem, and that is why investigators are generally cautious. They have to be, because the question is not which version sounds the clearest. The question is which information can be independently verified. That would have been the end of it, but another detail stood out. While thousands of people were focused on the enhanced audio, the broader investigation was still moving in other directions. Phone records, digital location information, witness accounts, search efforts, physical evidence, and Nolan's final known movements. Those details may not be as dramatic as a mysterious sound hidden inside a recording, but they can be far more important when investigators are trying to establish a reliable timeline. And that is where this story begins to move beyond the audio itself. Because when investigators encounter information that doesn't immediately line up, they don't automatically conclude that somebody is lying. A witness can remember an event differently because they were frightened. Someone may have had poor visibility. Time can change memories. Two people can experience the same moment and remember different details. One inconsistency alone may mean very little. But several independent facts pointing in the same direction can become much more significant. So as we move forward, the question isn't simply whether someone online believes they heard something hidden inside Nolan Wells's distress call. The larger question is whether that interpretation fits with everything else investigators know. And that is a much harder question to answer. Before we move into the next part of this story, take a moment and tell me where you're watching from. I've always found it remarkable how many different places people are joining us from, especially when a case like Nolan Wells brings so many people together. And while you're in the comments, tell me one thing. At this point in the story, what concerns you more, the questions surrounding the enhanced audio, or the questions surrounding Nolan's final known movements? There are good arguments on both sides, and I'd really like to see what you think. And if you've been following along this far, thank you for staying with me. Make sure you're subscribed, because in the next part we're going deeper into the evidence and some of the details that caused people to start looking at the timeline differently. By the time the enhanced audio became one of the biggest talking points surrounding Nolan Wells's case, something interesting had started to happen. People were no longer asking only what they could hear. They were asking whether the recording had been drawing attention away from the rest of the investigation. And that question matters, because the more versions of the recording appeared online, the more divided people became. One version seemed to reveal a word. Another sounded completely different. A third appeared to confirm what someone had already claimed. And before long, viewers were comparing 5, 6, sometimes even more versions of essentially the same recording. But there was a problem. If several different people take the same unclear recording and process it in different ways, which version should we trust? Based on the publicly available information, there is no indication that investigators endorsed the widely circulated internet versions as official evidence. That doesn't automatically mean those recordings are useless. It means something much simpler. We should not confuse a creator's interpretation with a verified investigative finding. And that distinction becomes even more important when artificial intelligence enters the picture. Only a few years ago, improving poor quality audio required specialized equipment and considerable technical knowledge. Today, someone can upload a recording into an AI-powered application and receive a processed version within minutes. For ordinary situations, that can be incredibly useful. An old family recording can become easier to hear. A damaged interview can become more understandable. Background noise can sometimes be reduced. But there is another side to the technology. Some systems don't simply remove unwanted sounds. They attempt to estimate what unclear speech might have been. And an estimate is not the same as preserved evidence. That difference can be easy to miss when you're listening through headphones and the result suddenly sounds remarkably clear. The voice seems closer. The background disappears. The words appear sharper. And your natural reaction may be, "There it is." But is it? That's the question investigators have to ask. And it's a question viewers should ask too. Imagine standing outside during a heavy rainstorm. Someone is across the street calling your name. You can almost hear them, but the rain is drowning out parts of the sound. Now imagine someone records that moment. Later, they remove the rain from the recording, increase certain frequencies, and process the voice. You may hear the person more clearly, or the processing may create sounds that your brain interprets as words. That doesn't mean the person who processed it intended to deceive anyone. It simply demonstrates the limitations of technology. And that brings us back to Nolan Wells. While millions of online views focused on the distress call, investigators were reportedly looking at something much broader. Phone records, digital location information, witness interviews, search efforts, physical evidence, vehicle movements, and the timeline of Nolan's final known movements. Each of those details represents another piece of the investigation. And investigators rarely ask whether one piece of evidence is interesting by itself. They ask whether the pieces fit together. Does a witness account match the available phone data? Does a reported timeline line up with digital records? Do independent sources point toward the same conclusion? Or is there something that doesn't fit? Those questions may not produce the dramatic moment that gets millions of views on TikTok, but they are often the questions that matter most. And then another issue emerged. The origin of the enhanced recording itself became difficult to establish. Copies were spreading rapidly across social media. A video would be downloaded. Someone would edit it again. Another person would upload that version. Someone else would add captions. Another creator would remove the captions and process the audio one more time. Eventually, a recording could be several steps removed from wherever it originally came from. And once that happens, tracing exactly what was done to the file becomes much harder. This is where the idea of chain of custody becomes important. If nobody can confidently explain where a digital file originated, who handled it, and how it changed over time, its value as evidence becomes much more limited. That principle isn't unique to Nolan Wells. Investigators face similar problems with edited photographs, videos, screenshots, text messages, and audio recordings. Technology has made information easier to share. It has also made verification more important. But there is another detail that deserves attention. When most of us listen to a recording, we naturally focus on the voice. Investigators may listen just as carefully to everything surrounding that voice. A passing vehicle, wind, birds, running water, construction equipment, a closing door, a distant engine. Those sounds may help establish location, timing, or distance, even when the spoken words remain difficult to understand. And that can be surprisingly important, because sometimes the background tells investigators more than the sentence everyone online is trying to decipher. Think about an old home video. You may barely remember what someone said in the background, but you remember the sound of a particular car, a dog barking, a church bell, a train passing nearby, a familiar radio program playing in another room. Those small details can provide context. The same principle can apply in forensic audio. Then something unexpected happened. Public attention slowly began shifting away from the recording itself. People started returning to Nolan's final known movements. They began comparing timelines, looking at publicly discussed witness accounts, reviewing reported digital activity, and searching for places where one piece of information didn't seem to line up neatly with another. Now, this is where we need to be careful. A contradiction does not automatically mean somebody lied. Human memory is complicated. Stress can affect what a person remembers. Poor visibility can create confusion. And time can change the way people recall an event. Two honest witnesses can remember the same moment differently. That's why investigators look for patterns. One inconsistency may not tell us much. Several independent facts pointing in the same direction can be much more significant. And that is why the timeline matters. Not because a timeline automatically gives us the answer, but because it allows investigators to compare one fact against another. If someone says they were somewhere at a particular time, investigators can potentially compare that statement with phone records. If a vehicle was reportedly seen somewhere, investigators may compare that with available digital information or witness accounts. If a particular event supposedly occurred at a certain time, investigators can ask whether the surrounding evidence supports it. Piece by piece, slowly, patiently. That is often how difficult investigations move forward. Meanwhile, the public conversation continues at a completely different speed. One new video can appear in the morning. By lunchtime, thousands of people may have watched it. By evening, another creator has responded. The next day, an entirely different theory is circulating. The investigation doesn't work that way. Investigators don't get to replace one theory with another every 24 hours. They have to establish what can actually be supported. And that can take time. Weeks become months. Months can become much longer. Meanwhile, families continue waiting. Friends continue hoping. And people watching from home continue looking for answers. That's the difficult part of following an unresolved case. We want certainty. We want a moment where somebody finally says, "This is what happened." But real investigations don't always provide that moment quickly. Sometimes progress comes from one quiet detail, one phone record, one witness statement that matches another, one overlooked piece of information that suddenly makes several other facts make more sense. Those discoveries may never become viral, but they can become important. And this is where I want to ask you something. We've covered quite a bit now, and this is where I'd really like to hear from you. If you had to choose one thing to focus on while trying to understand Nolan Wells' final known moments, what would it be? The audio? The phone records? The witness accounts? The timeline? Or the physical evidence? Tell me what you think in the comments, and more importantly, tell me why. Because sometimes the most interesting part of these discussions isn't simply what someone believes, it's the detail that led them there. And if you've been with me through the first two parts, thank you. Stay with me for the final part, because we're going to step back from the individual pieces and look at the bigger picture and the questions that still don't have clear answers. As we've followed this case, one theme has appeared again and again. The loudest conversation is not always the conversation that brings us closest to the truth, and that may be the most important thing to remember as we look at what comes next. The enhanced audio has been replayed countless times. People have slowed it down, cleaned it up, increased the volume, run it through different software, and listened again and again, hoping that one hidden word might finally explain what happened during Nolan Wells' final known moments. But the more versions appeared, the more difficult one simple question became. What exactly are we listening to? According to the publicly available information discussed throughout this story, authorities have not confirmed that the widely circulated enhanced recordings represent the official version used in the investigation. That does not prove the recordings have no value. It simply means we have to be careful about what conclusions we draw from them. And the same caution applies to the autopsy. The autopsy may provide important medical information. It may help establish injuries or contribute to a timeline, but it does not exist by itself. Investigators have to compare those findings with everything else they know: witness statements, phone records, digital evidence, search efforts, physical evidence, vehicle movements, and Nolan's final known movements. That is where the bigger picture begins to emerge. Not from one recording, not from one online theory, but from the question of whether all the available pieces can eventually fit together. Think about putting together an old jigsaw puzzle. You may find one piece with a bright color and immediately think you know where it belongs. You try to force it into a particular corner, but it doesn't quite fit. So you set it aside. Later, you find another piece, then another, and eventually, you realize the first piece belongs somewhere completely different. Investigations can work much the same way. Forcing one piece into place because it seems to support a theory doesn't make the picture clearer. It can actually make the entire puzzle more confusing. That is why investigators have to authenticate evidence. They have to determine where it came from. They have to understand how it was handled, and they have to establish whether it can withstand scrutiny. This becomes especially important in the age of artificial intelligence. Technology can now improve damaged photographs. It can make poor quality recordings easier to hear, and it can even generate or imitate voices with remarkable accuracy. Those tools can be useful, but they also create a new problem. As viewers, we have to learn the difference between enhancement and interpretation. A recording can be enhanced without creating new evidence, but when software begins estimating unclear information, the result needs to be treated with caution. That distinction could become increasingly important in investigations everywhere. Not just in Nolan Wells' case. Because technology is moving faster than most people realize, a recording that once required expensive equipment to process can now be uploaded from a phone. A photograph that once looked damaged beyond repair can be improved in seconds. And a piece of media can be altered, reposted, and shared thousands of times before most people even know where it originated. That creates a difficult environment for investigators, and it creates an equally difficult environment for the public, because we naturally want to believe what we can see and hear, especially when something seems to provide the answer we've been looking for. But evidence doesn't become stronger because thousands of people repeat the same interpretation. It becomes stronger when it can be independently verified. That principle has been around for generations, long before smartphones, long before TikTok, long before artificial intelligence, and it remains just as important now. There is another part of this story that deserves attention: the people following Nolan's case. Ordinary people from different cities, states, and countries have continued watching for updates. Some have searched public records. Some have shared news reports. Some have discussed the audio. Others have simply kept Nolan's story in the public conversation because they want his loved ones to receive answers. That kind of attention can matter, but there is a balance. Curiosity matters. Compassion matters too. Because behind every headline is a real family. Behind every social media post is a real human story, and behind every unanswered question is someone waiting for clarity. That is why respectful discussion matters. It is possible to ask difficult questions without pretending we already know the answers. It is possible to examine inconsistencies without automatically accusing someone of wrongdoing. And it is possible to remain interested in a case without allowing speculation to replace evidence. As of the publicly available information discussed here, several questions remain unanswered. Will investigators eventually release additional verified information? Will more details about Nolan's final known movements become public? Will future evidence help explain questions that remain unclear today? We simply don't have those answers yet, and pretending otherwise would not help. It would only make the search for the truth more difficult. This is also where the title of today's video deserves a second look. TikTok Investigator exposes more chilling evidence. It is certainly an attention-grabbing phrase. But what happens when we look beyond the headline? What we find is a case where online investigators and ordinary viewers are asking questions, examining recordings, comparing publicly discussed information, and looking for details that may deserve further attention. But an online investigation is not automatically an official investigation. A theory is not automatically a fact. And an enhanced recording is not automatically authenticated evidence. Those distinctions are important. They don't mean people should stop asking questions. Quite the opposite. Questions are often where investigations begin. But the next step is finding evidence that can support the answers. And that takes patience. Sometimes the most important development in a case is not a dramatic revelation. It may be one phone record, one witness statement, one piece of physical evidence, one timeline that finally makes sense. One overlooked detail that connects several other pieces, Those moments may never become viral, but they can become the foundation of an investigation. And perhaps that is the lesson Nolan Wells's case offers us right now. We don't have to choose between caring about the story and being careful with the facts. We can do both. We can listen, we can question, we can pay attention, and we can still say, we don't know yet. There is nothing weak about admitting uncertainty. Sometimes, it is the most honest thing we can say. Before you leave, I want to ask you one final question. After everything we've discussed today, what do you believe deserves the most attention going forward? The enhanced audio? Nolan's final known movements? The timeline? Or simply waiting for investigators to release more verified information? There may not be an easy answer, and that's exactly why I want to hear your thoughts. And if you've been following this case with us, tell us where you're watching from as well. It's always encouraging to see how far this community reaches. Most importantly, let's keep the conversation respectful. Behind every headline is a family, and behind every unanswered question is a real person whose story matters. If you appreciate long-form investigations where we slow things down, examine the available evidence, and don't rush to conclusions, subscribe to the channel. We'll continue following the Nolan Wells case, and when verified developments become available, we'll be here to go through them with you. Thank you for watching, and thank you for being part of the conversation.